Margaret Hale did not remember the last time her hands had felt warm. The scullery at Hartfield House was a world of steam and iron, where copper pots hung like dull moons and the stone floor leached every trace of heat from a body. Margaret had been awake since 4 in the morning, her fingers red from lye soap, her arms aching from hauling water. The great house above her was alive with silk and candlelight, a ball to celebrate the engagement of some viscount's daughter. But down here, there was only the rhythm of labor. She was not bitter. At 19, she had learned that bitterness was a luxury she could not afford. Her mother had died when Margaret was 12, her father 2 winters later. The workhouse had taught her to make herself small, silent, and useful. Hartfield House had given her a position as a scullery maid, and she clung to it with the quiet ferocity of someone who knew exactly how thin the line was between this life and the gutter. It was near midnight when the housekeeper, Mrs. Trent, sent her upstairs with a pitcher of hot water for the ladies' retiring room. Margaret was to go up the service stairs, deliver the water, and return without being seen, invisible as the steam that rose from the pitcher. She almost made it. The corridor leading to the retiring room was dim, lit by wall sconces that had burned low. Margaret moved quickly, her shoes silent on the runner. Then she heard the voices, bright, cruel, like shards of glass wrapped in honey. She should have turned away. She should have pressed herself into the shadow of the service door and waited. But the cruelty in those voices was not new to Margaret. She had heard it all her life, in the workhouse, in the kitchens, in the street. What stopped her was the silence that answered it. A woman stood with her back to the wall. She was older, perhaps 50, with silver threaded through her dark hair. Her gown was well-made but cut in a style at least a decade out of fashion, high waist, unadorned, the color of old ivory. She wore no jewels. The 3 women surrounding her were glittering with diamonds and feathers, their laughter sharp as knives. Lady Cecily Hartfield was the ringleader. Margaret knew her by sight, though she had never spoken a word to her directly. She was young, beautiful, and carried the particular viciousness of someone who had never been denied anything. "And where did you think you were going, madam?" Cecily was asking, her voice light. "The dining room is for guests. I'm sure you understand that a woman of your circumstances might feel more comfortable in the kitchens." "Perhaps she's lost," another woman added, eyes sliding over the older woman's gown. "The poor dear clearly hasn't kept up with the fashions. Is that a silk gown or a curtain?" The older woman did not speak. Her face was pale but composed. She held herself very still, her hands folded in front of her, and Margaret recognized that stillness. It was the stillness of someone who had learned to absorb blows without flinching, because flinching only invited more. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not fear. Not yet. It was anger, a quiet, blazing anger that she had no right to feel for a stranger, but she felt it anyway. She stepped forward. The movement drew attention. 3 pairs of eyes turned toward her, and for one sharp moment Margaret saw herself as they saw her. A scullery maid in a rough wool dress, her hair escaping its cap, her hands chapped and red, a pitcher of hot water in her arms. "What is this?" Cecily demanded, as though a rat had appeared from the walls. Margaret curtsied. It was not a graceful curtsy, her back ached too much for grace, but it was respectful. "Beg pardon, my lady," she said, and her voice was steady. "I've been sent by the housekeeper. The lady in the ivory gown is wanted below stairs for an urgent matter." The lie landed like a stone in still water. An urgent matter. Cecily's smile was thin. What matter could possibly concern this person? Margaret did not look at the older woman. She kept her eyes on Cecily, because looking at the victim would be a betrayal. It would confirm that she saw the humiliation. "A private matter, my lady," Margaret said. "My instructions were to find the lady and bring her directly. The housekeeper does not tolerate delay." It was the small, sacred authority of the servant class. Mrs. Trent did not tolerate delay. Everyone in the house knew that, even the gentry who pretended the servants were invisible. The older woman moved. She stepped away from the wall, and Margaret saw that her hands were shaking, though her face remained calm. "I will come," the woman said. Her voice was low, refined, with an accent that spoke of northern roots long softened by years away. Margaret turned and began to walk. She did not wait for Cecily's permission. Behind her, she heard the rustle of silk and the beginning of some protest, but she did not turn around. She led the woman down the service stairs, through the narrow passage that smelled of tallow and bread, into the warm, dark kitchen. The fire was still burning. The other servants had gone to bed. Margaret set the pitcher on the table and, because she did not know what else to do, pulled out a wooden chair. "Please," she said, "sit." The woman sat. Her composure held until the moment her back touched the chair, and then something in her seemed to fold inward. Her shoulders dropped. Her hands unclenched in her lap. She pressed her lips together, and Margaret saw that her eyes were bright with tears she refused to shed. Margaret did not speak. She went to the sideboard, cut a thick slice of bread, spread it with butter, and set it before the woman along with a cup of cold tea. It was not much. It was what there was. "You should eat," Margaret said. "The bread is good." The woman looked at the bread, then at Margaret. Her gaze was clear and searching. "What is your name?" she asked. "Margaret Hale, ma'am." "You defended me." Margaret hesitated. "I did what seemed right, ma'am." The woman picked up the bread. She did not eat it. She held it as though it were something precious. "Do you know who I am?" she asked. Margaret shook her head. The woman was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "No, I do not suppose you do." She took a bite of the bread. It was a small, deliberate act, and somehow it felt like a victory. Margaret waited. She did not ask questions. She understood that sometimes a person needed to be silent before they could speak. "I have not been spoken of kindly in a very long time," the woman said. "I had forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside me." Margaret did not know what to say, so she said nothing. She simply stood there, a scullery maid with cracked hands, and kept the woman company in the warm, dark kitchen. Dawn came gray and unforgiving. Margaret had barely slept. She had returned to the scullery after showing the woman to the servants' entrance, making certain she had a hackney to carry her home. The woman had pressed a coin into Margaret's hand, a sovereign, far too much, and Margaret had refused. The woman had only smiled and closed Margaret's fingers around the gold. "A debt is a burden," she said. "Let it be a gift instead." Margaret had hidden the coin in her boot. She did not trust the other maids. She was scrubbing the great copper pot when Mrs. Trent appeared in the doorway. The housekeeper's face was grim. "Margaret," she said, "Lady Cecily has reported you for impertinence. You stepped out of your place. You spoke to your betters as though you had a right to address them." Margaret set down her brush. Her heart was beating hard, but her voice was calm. "The lady was being mocked," she said. "I merely delivered a message." "You lied," Mrs. Trent said. "I sent no such message." Margaret said nothing. There was no point. The truth had no power here. Mrs. Trent sighed. "I am sorry, child. You have been a decent worker, but I cannot keep you. The family has demanded your dismissal." Margaret stood. She untied her apron and folded it neatly. She did not cry. She did not beg. "May I collect my things?" she asked. "Be gone within the hour," Mrs. Trent said, and turned away. Margaret left Hartfield House with her small bundle of belongings and the sovereign hidden in her boot. The morning air was damp, the road muddy. She walked toward the village, not sure where she would go. There was a lodging house on the edge of the parish that sometimes took in displaced servants. She had enough coin for 2 nights, perhaps 3. The carriage appeared as she reached the crossroads. It was black, polished, drawn by 4 horses, with a crest on the door that Margaret did not recognize. It stopped beside her and the footman jumped down. "Miss Margaret Hale?" he asked. Margaret froze. "I am Margaret Hale." The footman opened the carriage door. Inside sat a man. He was young, perhaps 30, with dark hair, a hard jaw, and eyes the color of winter fog. He was dressed in black and gray, impeccably tailored, and there was nothing soft about him. "Get in," he said. Margaret did not move. "Who are you?" "Elias Coldwell," the man said, as though the name should mean something. "Duke of Ashcombe." The words hit her like a physical blow. A duke. The Duke of Ashcombe. She had heard the name in kitchens and gossip, cold, proud, a man who could freeze a room with a glance. He was said to be the wealthiest peer in the northern counties and the most dangerous man to cross in London. Margaret curtsied. It was awkward on the muddy road, but she managed. "Your Grace," she said, "I have not done anything wrong." "Get in the carriage," he repeated, "and we shall discuss that." She had no choice. She could not outrun a duke's carriage. She climbed inside and sat across from him, her bundle in her lap, her back straight despite her exhaustion. The carriage began to move. "Last night," he said, "you intervened in a matter at Hartfield House. You lied to protect a woman from public mockery." Margaret's jaw tightened. "I did not know she was," she stopped. "Whoever she is, she was being tormented." "She is my mother," the Duke said flatly, "the Dowager Duchess of Ashcombe." Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. His mother, the woman in the faded gown, the woman with the tired eyes and the perfect stillness, she was a duchess, a Dowager Duchess, and Margaret had offered her stale bread and cold tea in a kitchen. "I see," Margaret said quietly. "Do you?" The Duke's voice was cool. "You defended a woman you did not know and lost your position for it. Now you are walking to the village with nowhere to go. Tell me, Miss Hale, what do you see?" Margaret met his eyes. It was not easy, his gaze was like a blade, but she did not look away. "I see a man who was not there," she said. Something flickered in his expression, surprise, quickly crushed. "And where were you, Your Grace?" Margaret asked. "While your mother was cornered in a corridor by 3 women who treated her like filth, where were you?" The Duke's face went hard. "You forget yourself." "I have been dismissed, homeless, and stopped on the road by a stranger," Margaret said. "I have nothing left to forget." Silence filled the carriage. The wheels rattled over stone. The Duke watched her with an unreadable expression, and Margaret watched him back. "I am offering you a position," he said at last, "as lady's maid to my mother." Margaret stared at him. "You are offering me a position because I did the right thing." "I am offering you a position because my mother asked me to find you," he said. "She believes you have a rare quality. I am not entirely convinced, but I am not inclined to ignore my mother's wishes at present." It was not a warm offer. It was not even a kind one, but it was honest. Margaret turned her head and looked out the window. The countryside was green and gray, the fields still wet with morning. She thought about the workhouse. She thought about the cold, the hunger, the long days of labor. She thought about her mother, who had died with a cough that rattled like chains. "I will accept," she said, turning back to him. "But I am not a charity case. I will work for my wages, and I will not be spoken to as though I am a stray dog." The Duke raised an eyebrow. "Noted." "I have conditions," she continued. "I will be loyal to your mother. I will serve her well. But I will not lie for you, and I will not be silenced when something is wrong." He studied her for a long moment. Then, to her shock, his mouth curved into something that was almost a smile. "You are," he said, "the strangest lady's maid I have ever employed." "That is because I am not a lady's maid," Margaret said. "I am a scullery maid who was in the right place at the right time." The Duke leaned back against the cushions. "Then let us see if you can learn." The carriage rolled on toward London, carrying a scullery maid who had just spoken to a duke as though they were equals, and a duke who had just discovered that being challenged was not nearly as unpleasant as he had expected. Ashcombe House rose out of Grosvenor Square like a monument to cold elegance. Margaret had never seen anything like it. The front door alone was tall enough to admit a carriage, and the marble floors gleamed with a polish that belonged in a cathedral. But there was no warmth in the house, no laughter. The servants moved like ghosts, silent and precise, never speaking above a whisper. The housekeeper, Mrs. Farrow, received Margaret with practiced efficiency. She was shown to a small room on the fourth floor, given 3 plain dresses, and instructed in the duties of a lady's maid. The Dowager Duchess, she was told, kept her rooms at the back of the house, away from the grand salons and the formal dining room. "Her Grace does not go into society," Mrs. Farrow said, her tone carefully neutral. "She remains in her chambers or walks in the private garden. You will attend to her wardrobe, her hair, and her personal comfort. You will not speak of her to anyone outside this house." Margaret nodded. She had no intention of speaking to anyone anyway. The dowager's rooms were comfortable but dim. The curtains were perpetually half-drawn, as though the sun had been instructed not to intrude. The furniture was old and heavy, remnants from a grander era, now scuffed at the edges and faded by time. The dowager herself was sitting by the window when Margaret was brought in. She wore a simple gray dress, no jewelry, her silver hair loose over her shoulders. When she saw Margaret, her face softened. "You came," she said. Margaret curtsied. "I did, Your Grace." "Come here," the dowager said. "Let me look at you." Margaret approached. The dowager took her hands, the cracked, red hands that no amount of work could soften, and held them gently. "I am glad," the dowager said. "I was not certain you would accept." "I had no other prospects," Margaret admitted. The dowager smiled. Honesty, how refreshing. It was not an easy position. Margaret worked from dawn until late, learning the intricate rituals of a lady's wardrobe. She learned how to arrange hair, how to press silk, how to move through a grand house without being seen. The other servants treated her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She was an outsider, a scullery maid elevated to a position of proximity to the Duchess. They did not know whether to envy her or pity her. The Duke, meanwhile, remained a remote presence. Margaret saw him only at a distance in the hall, on the stair, riding out in the mornings. He never spoke to her. He never looked at her. And yet she felt his attention like a weight whenever she entered a room. It was the dowager who told her the truth. "My husband," she said one afternoon as Margaret mended a tear in an old shawl, "was not a kind man. He was charming and handsome and utterly faithless. He kept mistresses openly. He mocked me in front of his friends, and when I grew older he simply erased me." Margaret looked up from her sewing. "Erased you?" "He told society I was ill," the dowager said. "Mentally unwell, too fragile for company. He kept me here in these rooms while he lived his life in town. No one questioned it. A duke's word is law." Margaret's hands tightened on the fabric. "And your son?" The dowager's expression flickered. "My son was 12 when his father began the charade. He grew up believing his mother was a hysteric. He was taught to be ashamed of me." "That is monstrous," Margaret said quietly. "It is aristocratic," the dowager corrected, a faint, bitter smile on her lips. "There is a difference." As the weeks passed, Margaret began to understand the shape of the bond between mother and son. Elias came to his mother's rooms once a week, on Sunday afternoons, for exactly 15 minutes. He sat in a chair by the fire, asked after her health, and left. They never touched. They never laughed. They were strangers bound by blood and obligation. Margaret found herself watching him during those visits. She saw the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when his mother mentioned the past. He was not indifferent. He was something worse. He was ashamed. And shame, Margaret knew, was a prison with no locks on the outside. She began to speak to him in small ways. It was not insubordination. She was too clever for that. It was the placement of a teacup, the angle of a chair, the way she would say, "Her Grace was feeling unwell this morning, Your Grace," with a tone that carried layers of meaning. One evening, after the Duke had left his mother's rooms, Margaret followed him into the hall. "Your Grace." He turned. His expression was cool but not hostile. "What is it, Miss Hale?" "Your mother had a visitor today." Margaret said, "Lord Cecil." The Duke's face did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "Lord Cecil called on my mother." "He called on you," Margaret said. "When you were out, he asked after your mother. He waited in the drawing room for an hour." The Duke's jaw tightened. "That man is a serpent." "I am aware," Margaret said. "He spoke to me. He asked my name. He said he hoped to see more of me in London." The Duke stepped closer. It was not a threatening movement, but it was deliberate. He was suddenly very near, his height a shadow over her. "And what did you say?" "I said nothing," Margaret replied. "A servant does not converse with callers." She did not step back. She did not lower her eyes. "But you are telling me now," the Duke said. "Because you are my employer," Margaret said, "and I do not like serpents." For a long moment they stood in the dim corridor, the silence heavy between them. Then the Duke's mouth curved, not a smile but close. "I do not like them either, Miss Hale." He turned and walked away, and Margaret felt the echo of his presence long after he had gone. Lord Cecil returned the following week. This time, Margaret was in the drawing room when he was announced. He was not handsome, but he had the kind of polished charm that made people forget that. He smiled at Margaret as though she were a puzzle he intended to solve. "Miss Hale," he said, "the scullery maid who became the talk of Mayfair." Margaret felt her blood chill. "I do not know what you mean, my lord." "Do you not?" He circled her slowly, like a shark in a well-cut coat. "A girl from the gutters, taken into a duke's household, attending his mother. It is a very romantic story." "It is a very ordinary story," Margaret said. "I was given a position, I work. There is nothing romantic about labor." Lord Cecil laughed. It was a pleasant sound, and that made it worse. "You are clever," he said. "I like clever women, they make life interesting." The door opened, and the Duke entered. His eyes went from Lord Cecil to Margaret, and his expression turned to stone. "Cecil," he said, "you are early." Lord Cecil turned with his charming smile. "I came to see the infamous Miss Hale. The ton is buzzing about your new addition, Ashcombe, a scullery maid in a duke's house. How delicious." Elias walked past him to the mantel. His posture was relaxed, but Margaret could see the tension in his hands. "Miss Hale," he said quietly, "leave us." Margaret curtsied and left, but not before she caught Lord Cecil's gaze. He was smiling at her. It was a smile that promised trouble. She did not know then how much trouble it would be. The dinner party was the dowager's idea. Margaret had watched the dowager's spirits shift over the weeks. She was still melancholy, still prone to long silences by the window, but there was a spark now, a flicker of life that had not existed before. She began to ask for brighter gowns. She began to speak of the world beyond the walls. "I have been hidden for too long," she told Margaret one morning. "I want to see people. I want to host a dinner." Margaret knew it was not her place to encourage or discourage, but she also knew that a dowager duchess appearing in society after years of seclusion would be an event, and not necessarily a kind one. "Are you certain, Your Grace?" she asked gently. "I am not certain of anything," the dowager said, "but I refuse to die in these rooms." The Duke, when informed, was less enthusiastic. "It is unwise," he said. "You have not appeared in society for 15 years. The gossip will be merciless." "Let it be merciless," the dowager said. "I have survived worse." The dinner was arranged for a Saturday evening. 12 guests, all carefully selected, not the highest of the ton, but respectable families with moderate influence. Margaret helped the dowager dress in a deep blue silk gown, the first new gown she had worn in a decade. The dowager's hands trembled as Margaret fastened the buttons. "I'm afraid," the dowager whispered. Margaret paused. She met the dowager's eyes in the mirror. You faced 3 cruel women in a corridor and did not weep, Margaret said. You can face a dinner party. The dowager smiled faintly. I did weep after you left. But not in front of them, Margaret said. That is what matters. The guests arrived. Margaret stayed in the shadows, as servants did. She served wine, cleared plates, moved through the room like a quiet current. She saw the way the guests looked at the dowager, curious, pitying, some openly surprised that she was not the raving invalid rumor had painted. And then Lady Cecily Hartfield walked in. Margaret's blood turned to ice. Cecily was on the arm of Lord Cecil, who had secured an invitation through a mutual acquaintance. She was dressed in pale pink, her hair perfectly curled, her smile as bright as cut glass. The dowager saw her and went still. "My dear Dowager Duchess," Cecily said, sweeping into the room as though she owned it. "How wonderful to see you out of your rooms." The words were polite, the tone was acid. The dowager did not reply. Her face was pale, her composure cracking at the edges. Margaret stepped forward not to speak, but to be present. She took the dowager's arm gently and leaned in. "Your Grace," she murmured, "the soup course is ready." It was a small thing, an anchor. The dowager took a breath and nodded. The dinner proceeded. Margaret moved among the guests, keeping one eye on Cecily, who was watching the dowager with the predatory patience of a cat. When the main course was served, Cecily struck. "I hear," she said, loud enough for half the table, "that your new lady's maid is the scullery maid who was dismissed from Hartfield House for impertinence. Is that true, your Grace?" The table fell quiet. The dowager set down her fork. "Margaret Hale is my maid," she said quietly. "Her past is not a topic for dinner conversation." "But it is so fascinating," Cecily said, her smile widening. "A scullery maid who thought she could speak to her betters, and now she is here, serving at the table of a duchess. It is almost a fairy story." Lord Cecil laughed softly. "Perhaps the fairy story has a darker edge, Lady Cecily. Perhaps the maid has ambitions beyond serving." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Margaret felt every eye in the room turned toward her. She did not flinch. She did not drop the wine bottle she was holding. She simply stood still, her face calm, her heart pounding. The dowager rose from her chair. "Margaret Hale," she said, and her voice was no longer quiet, "is the reason I am sitting at this table. She is the reason I am not dead in a corridor at your house, Lady Cecily, with your laughter as my epitaph." The silence was absolute. "When you tormented me at Hartfield House," the dowager continued, her voice ringing with years of suppressed anger, "she came out of the shadows and stood beside me. She offered me bread and tea. She treated me like a human being, something no one in this room has done for me in 15 years. Cecily's face had gone white. Lord Cecil was watching with interest, like a man at a play. "So yes," the dowager said, "she was a scullery maid, and I would rather have her at my table than any of you." She sat down. The room was frozen. Margaret did not know where to look. The Duke, seated at the head of the table, had not spoken. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on his mother. And in that moment, Margaret saw something she had not seen before. He was seeing her, not the invalid, not the embarrassment. His mother, the woman who had just defended a servant in front of the tun with the same quiet ferocity that Margaret had used in the corridor. The dinner party ended. The guests departed in a flurry of strained smiles and whispered gossip. Cecily left on Lord Cecil's arm, her face a mask of barely contained fury. Margaret was in the kitchen when the Duke found her. She was washing dishes. It was not her duty anymore, but her hands needed work. They always needed work. "Miss Hale." She turned. He stood in the doorway, still in his evening clothes, his cravat loosened, his face shadowed. "Your Grace." He walked toward her. He stopped when he was close enough that she could smell the wine on his breath and the smoke from the candles. "My mother defended you tonight," he said. Yes, Margaret said. She has never defended anyone, he said. She has spent 15 years in silence, but tonight she stood up and spoke, because of you. Margaret set down the dish, because she was ready, not because of me. The Duke shook his head slowly. I have treated her like a problem to be managed. I have kept her hidden because I was ashamed, and tonight she showed more courage than I have shown in my entire life. Margaret said nothing. She had learned that silence was sometimes the kindest response. I misjudged you, he said. When you first came here, I thought you were an opportunist. I thought you had schemed to enter this house. I know, Margaret said. And now? Now you know I am only a scullery maid with cracked hands and a stubborn streak, she said. Your Grace. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out slowly and took her hand. He turned it over, palm up, and looked at the calluses, the burns, the years of labor written into her skin. These are not the hands of an opportunist, he said quietly. Margaret pulled her hand away. Do not do that. Do what? Look at me as though I am something new to you, she said. I am not new. I am old. I have been here all along, like 1,000 other girls you have never seen. I am only visible because I happen to stand in a corridor at the right moment. The Duke's face tightened. That is not fair. It is perfectly fair, Margaret said. You are a duke, I am a servant. We are not the same and we never will be. Kindness from you is not kindness, it is condescension. She turned back to the dishes. Her hands were trembling, but she would not let him see. Good night, Your Grace, she said. He did not leave. She felt his presence behind her, a weight in the room. Then quietly he said, You are wrong, Miss Hale. You are the only person in this house who has ever told me the truth. She heard his footsteps recede. The kitchen door closed, and Margaret stood alone among the dirty dishes, her hands in the water, her heart a storm. The garden at Ashcombe House was small but exquisite. Margaret walked there in the early morning before the house awoke, when the dew was still on the roses and the sky was the color of pearls. It was the only time she felt she could breathe. The rest of the day belonged to duty and the careful navigation of a household that had been stirred into chaos by the dinner party. The ton was buzzing. The dowager's speech had spread through London like fire through dry grass. Everyone had an opinion. Some praised her courage, most mocked it, and the scandal of the scullery maid turned lady's maid had taken on a life of its own, fed by Lady Cecily's relentless gossip. Margaret knew what was being said. She heard it from the other servants, from the footmen who returned from the market with whispers, from the maids who read the scandal sheets in secret. The Duke had become a target. His enemies, and a man of his wealth and position had many enemies, saw an opportunity. A duke who employed a peasant whose mother had publicly embarrassed a peer's daughter was a duke who could be attacked. Lord Cecil was leading the charge. He had begun to appear at events where the Duke was present. He smiled and charmed and dropped poison into every conversation. He implied that the Duke's interest in his mother's maid was not entirely proper. He suggested that the dowager's sudden reappearance was a scheme of Margaret's making. The Duke did not respond. He moved through London with his usual cold composure, ignoring the whispers, but Margaret could see the strain in his eyes. And she saw something else too. The Duke had begun to change. He came to his mother's rooms more often, not just on Sundays. He came in the evenings after dinner and sat by the fire. He asked her questions about the years before his father's cruelty. He listened, his face tight with something that looked like grief. One evening he arrived with a book. It was a novel, the kind his mother had loved in her youth. He said nothing as he handed it to her. He simply sat down and waited. The dowager looked at the book, then at him. Her eyes filled with tears. You remember, she whispered. I remember you reading to me, he said, when I was a child before. He did not finish. The dowager reached out and took his hand. It was the first time Margaret had seen them touch. Margaret stood in the corner watching. She felt like an intruder, but she also felt something warm kindle in her chest. Not hope, something quieter, the knowledge that broken things could sometimes be mended. It was later that night when the Duke found her in the garden. She had slipped outside after her duties, needing air, needing silence. The moon was high, the roses silver in its light. She heard his footsteps on the gravel, but she did not turn. "Miss Hale." "Your Grace." He came to stand beside her. For a moment, neither spoke. The city was quiet around them, the distant rumble of carriages, a soft reminder that London never truly slept. "I owe you an apology," he said at last. Margaret glanced at him. "You have done nothing wrong." "I have done everything wrong," he said. "I brought you here out of obligation, not respect. I assumed the worst of you. I treated you as a problem to be solved." "You treated me as a servant," Margaret said, "which is what I am." "No," he said. "You are not just a servant. You are the woman who saved my mother's life. Not her physical life, something more important. You saved her from being erased entirely." Margaret turned to face him. In the moonlight, his face was all sharp angles and shadows, his eyes dark with something she could not name. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I want you to know," he said, "that I am not the man I was. I am trying to be better, because of you." Margaret shook her head. "You are trying to be better because you want to be better, not because of me. I am only a mirror. You do not like what you see in it." He stepped closer. "Perhaps, but you are the only mirror I have ever been able to look into without turning away." The words hung between them. Margaret felt her heart quicken. She did not want this. She did not want to feel anything for this man, this Duke, this cold and arrogant stranger who had stumbled into her life and turned it upside down. But she did feel something. It was not love. It was not yet love. But it was the seed of something that could grow into love, and that terrified her. "I am leaving," she said. The Duke went still. "Leaving?" "At the end of the season," Margaret said. "I will find another position, far from London, far from this." "Why?" "Because I cannot stay here," she said. "You know why." He reached for her then, not roughly, not with command. He took her hands gently and held them. "Stay," he said. "Not as a servant, stay as—" He stopped, as if the words were too heavy to speak. Margaret pulled her hands away. "As what, Your Grace? Your mistress? The woman the Ton already believes is your paramour. I will not be that. I will not be anyone's shameful secret." "That is not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" she demanded. "You cannot offer me marriage. You are a duke. I am a scullery maid. The world would crucify us both." The Duke opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no answer, because there was no answer. The world they lived in was built on rules, and those rules were not kind to people like Margaret. "I am sorry," he said at last. "So am I," Margaret whispered. She turned and walked back toward the house, leaving him alone in the moonlit garden, a man who had finally learned to feel something real, only to discover that feeling was not enough. The scandal broke on a Thursday. Margaret was in the servants' hall when she heard the news. One of the footmen came rushing in, his face flushed, holding a crumpled scandal sheet. The words leapt out at her like sparks from a fire. "The Duke of Ashcombe's household in turmoil. A servant's rise, a mother's shame, and a family's secrets." She did not need to read the rest. She could imagine it. The details were lurid and false. Margaret was portrayed as a scheming seductress, the dowager as a crazed recluse, the Duke as a fool who had been manipulated by both. Lady Cecily was quoted as a source close to the family, describing Margaret's impertinence and ambition. The Ton devoured it. Within days, Margaret could not step outside without being stared at. The maids at other houses whispered behind their hands. Tradesmen looked at her with knowing smiles. It was as though she had become a public spectacle, a character in a play she had never agreed to perform. The Duke was furious. He summoned his solicitors, threatened lawsuits, demanded retractions. But the damage was done. Scandal could not be unprinted. It could only be survived. The dowager took to her rooms again, not from shame this time, but from fury. She paced the floor, her eyes bright with a grief that had hardened into anger. "I will not allow this," she said. "I will not allow that Hartfield girl to destroy the only good thing that has happened to me." "Your Grace," Margaret said gently, "you must not agitate yourself. The gossip will pass. It always does." "It should never have begun," the dowager said. I should have been stronger. I should have stood up to my husband years ago. I should have protected my son from his lies, but I was too weak." "You are not weak now," Margaret said. The dowager stopped packing. She looked at Margaret and her eyes softened. "There is a letter," she said quietly, "in my writing desk. It was written by Lady Cecily's father, Lord Hartfield, years ago. It is a confession. He borrowed money from my husband and never repaid it. He wrote things about his daughter, cruel things. He said she was a liar and a schemer, that she had been caught forging letters to entrap a suitor." Margaret stared at her. "How did you get such a letter?" "Lord Hartfield sent it to my husband as proof of his loyalty," the dowager said. "He wanted to borrow more money. My husband kept it. When he died, it came to me among his papers." "And you never used it?" The dowager shook her head. "I did not want to become the kind of person who uses other people's sins as weapons. But now," she looked at Margaret, "now I am tempted." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. The letter could destroy Lady Cecily. It could expose her as a fraud, a liar, the daughter of a man who had called her a schemer. It could end the gossip. But it would also destroy a family. It would make the dowager a weapon in the same society that had already crushed her. "Do not use it," Margaret said. The dowager blinked. "What?" "Do not use it," Margaret repeated. "You have survived 15 years of cruelty without becoming cruel. If you use that letter, you become like them. You let them win." The dowager's face crumpled. "But they are destroying you." "They are trying to destroy me," Margaret said. "But they cannot, because I do not care what they think. I have never had a reputation to protect. I have only my own self-respect, and that is not for sale." The dowager wept then. Margaret held her, not as a servant holds a mistress, but as one woman holds another. The Duchess cried for all the years of silence, for the son she had lost, for the life she had been denied. And Margaret stood steady through it all. That evening, the Duke came to Margaret's room. It was improper. She knew it was improper, but she let him in because she was too tired to fight. "I am going to end this," he said. "I am going to take my mother to the Haversham ball tomorrow night, publicly, with you at her side. I am going to show London that I am not ashamed of either of you." Margaret looked at him. His face was set with determination, but his eyes were uncertain. "And what will that accomplish?" she asked. "They will only whisper louder." "Let them whisper," he said. "I am done hiding. My mother spent 15 years in these walls because of my father's cruelty and my own cowardice. I will not add to that. Not any more." Margaret studied him. The arrogance was still there, the cold edges. But there was something else too, a raw honesty that had not been there before. "You are not doing this for me," she said. "I am doing it for all of us," he said. "But yes, in part I am doing it for you, because you told me the truth when no one else would, because you stood in a corridor and defended a stranger, because you are the bravest person I have ever met." Margaret felt tears rise in her eyes. She blinked them back. "I am not brave," she said. "I am only tired." "That is what bravery is," the Duke said, "being tired and still standing." He did not touch her. He did not offer empty promises. He simply stood in the narrow room, a duke in a servant's quarters, and looked at her as though she were the only thing in the world that mattered. "Tomorrow," he said, "will you stand with us?" Margaret took a breath. The season was nearly over. She had planned to leave. She had promised herself she would leave. But standing there in the dim light with this impossible man, she knew that leaving was no longer an option. Not because she loved him, but because she could not abandon the woman who had become like a mother to her. Not because she wanted to stay, but because she would not run. "Yes," she said, "I will stand with you." And for the first time in a very long time, Margaret Hale felt the stirrings of something that felt almost like hope. The Haversham Ball was the last great event of the season. It was held at Haversham House, a sprawling mansion of white stone and glittering windows, and the ton arrived in carriages that stretched for blocks. The air was thick with perfume and whispered anticipation. Everyone had heard the rumors. Everyone knew that the Duke of Ashcombe was expected to appear with his mother and the infamous scullery maid. And so, when the Ashcombe carriage pulled up to the door, the crowd on the pavement fell silent. The Duke stepped out first. He was dressed in black, his expression cold and closed. But when he turned to help his mother descend, something softened. The dowager emerged slowly, regally, her silver hair powdered, her gown a deep burgundy silk that caught the candlelight. She looked like a woman who had been asleep for years and had finally decided to wake up. And then Margaret stepped out. She wore a gown of pale blue, simple but elegant, with no jewels except a single strand of pearls that the dowager had insisted she wear. Her hair was arranged simply, her face calm. She looked like a lady, not because of the gown, but because of the way she carried herself, with the quiet dignity of someone who had survived the worst and was no longer afraid. The crowd parted. The three of them walked through the doors into the ballroom. The music did not stop, but the dancing slowed. Heads turned. Whispers spread like ripples in a pond. Margaret felt the weight of 100 gazes, but she did not flinch. The Duke walked beside her, his mother on his other arm, and together they moved into the room as though they owned it. Lord Cecil was there. Lady Cecily was there. They stood near the punch table, their faces frozen in matching masks of shock. The Duke led his mother and Margaret to the center of the floor. He raised his hand, and the musicians faltered into silence. "My lords and ladies," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "I present to you my mother, the Dowager Duchess of Ashcombe, and her companion, Miss Margaret Hale." A murmur rose, someone gasped, someone else laughed nervously. The Duke ignored them all. "I am aware," he continued, "that there have been rumors, gossip, cruel and false words spread by people who have nothing better to do than tear down others. I am here to say that I do not care. My mother is the bravest woman I know, and Miss Hale is the most honorable. They are my family, and I am proud to stand with them." The room was stunned. This was not how society worked. You did not challenge the ton, you bowed to it, you appeased it. You smiled and pretended that the poison was not poison. But Elias Coldwell had never been like other men. He was a duke, and dukes, when they chose to, could break the rules. Lady Cecily stepped forward. Her face was pale, but her eyes were bright with fury. "This is absurd," she said. "You are making a mockery of us all. That woman is a servant, a scullery maid. She has no place here." The dowager stepped forward. "She has more place here than you," she said quietly. "She has more honor than you, more courage, more kindness. And if you speak another word against her, I will make certain that every person in this room learns the truth about you." Cecily went white. "What truth?" The dowager smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a woman who had nothing left to lose. "I have a letter," she said, "in your father's own hand. It is a very interesting letter, but I have decided not to use it because I am not you." She turned away. The room held its breath. And then, from the edge of the crowd, Lord Cecil began to laugh. "A letter," he said, his voice dripping with scorn. "How very dramatic, but it does not change the facts. Miss Hale is a commoner, a peasant. She was a scullery maid at Hartfield House. Everyone knows it. Everyone has always known it. She can never be one of us." Margaret stepped forward. Her voice was clear and steady. I have never wanted to be one of you, she said. I have seen how you treat each other. I have seen your cruelty and your gossip and your lies. I have cleaned your floors and washed your dishes and listened to your secrets. I know what you are, and I would rather be a scullery maid in an honest kitchen than a lady in a house built on cruelty. The silence was absolute. Every eye was on her. The Duke was watching her with something that looked like awe. You may mock me, Margaret continued. You may whisper about me. You may tell your friends that I am nothing, but I know what I am. I am a woman who saw a stranger being hurt and did not look away. I am a woman who lost everything and did not beg. I am a woman who will not be broken by the likes of you. She turned to the dowager. Your Grace, I believe the next dance is a waltz. The dowager laughed. It was a real laugh, bright and unexpected. I believe it is. They walked toward the dance floor. The musicians, after a moment of confusion, began to play. The Duke watched them go. Then he turned to Lord Cecil and Lady Cecily. You are both invited to leave, he said quietly. Now. They left. The waltz began. The dowager moved with surprising grace, and Margaret matched her step by step. They danced together, two women who had no right to be at the center of a grand ballroom, but who had earned their place through courage and kindness. The Duke watched from the edge of the floor. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were bright. When the dance ended, he crossed the floor and bowed to Margaret. May I have the next? He asked. She looked at him. The music was starting again, a slower melody, soft and sweet. Yes, she said. They danced. His hand was warm on her waist, her hand light on his shoulder. They moved together as though they had done this 100 times, as though the years of distance and class and fear had never existed. I love you, he said quietly. Margaret's heart stopped. Then it began again, pounding. I know, she said. I have no right to say it, he continued. I have been a fool, a coward, a man who did not see what was in front of him, but I see it now. I see you. Margaret looked up at him. His gray eyes were no longer cold. They were warm and scared and full of hope. I am not a lady, she said. I do not care. I have no fortune, no family, no connections. I do not care. The ton will never accept me. Let them choke on it. Margaret laughed. It was a small sound, surprised and bright. You are impossible. I am a duke, he said. We are allowed to be impossible. The music swelled. Around them the room began to blur. There were people watching, still whispering, still judging. But Margaret did not see them. She saw only Elias, the man she had stood beside in a corridor, the man who had offered her bread and tea and asked nothing in return. The man she loved. I will stay, she said. Not as your servant, not as your mistress. I will stay as myself, Margaret Hale. And if you can accept that, all of it, the cracked hands and the stubborn pride and the past that will never leave me, then I will stay. He pulled her closer. Not too close. They were still in public, still bound by the rules that had shaped their lives, but close enough that she could feel his breath on her hair. I accept, he said. All of it, all of you, always. The dance ended. The room erupted into applause, whether genuine or mocking, Margaret could not tell. She did not care. The dowager was watching from the side of the floor, her eyes bright with tears, her hands clasped together. Margaret went to her. Your Grace, she said. The dowager reached out and cupped Margaret's face. You called me your Grace, but you have never called me anything else. Not once. What should I call you? Margaret asked. The dowager smiled through her tears. Call me Elizabeth. My name is Elizabeth. Margaret felt her own eyes fill. Elizabeth, she repeated. The dowager pulled her into an embrace. It was warm and fierce and full of years of longing. I never had a daughter, Elizabeth whispered, but I think in you I have found one. The Duke came to stand beside them. He looked at his mother, then at Margaret, and something in his face shifted. The coldness was gone. The shame was gone. In their place was something new, something tender and fragile and real. "I think," he said quietly, "that we have all found something." They stood together, the three of them in the center of the ballroom. The Tun watched and whispered and wondered, but it did not matter. Because for the first time in 15 years, the Dowager Duchess of Ashcombe was not hidden. She was seen. And for the first time in her life, Margaret Hale was not invisible. She was loved. The season ended, the gossip faded, and in a small church in the countryside on a quiet morning in late summer, Margaret Hale married Elias Coldwell, the Duke of Ashcombe. It was a modest ceremony. Only a few attended. The Tun, of course, was scandalized. But the bride and groom did not care. They walked out of the church into the sunlight, hand in hand, and behind them came Elizabeth, the Dowager Duchess, her face bright with joy. They climbed into the carriage, and the horses began to move, carrying them toward Ashcombe, not to the cold house in London, but to the estate in the north, where the gardens were wild and the hills rolled on forever. Margaret leaned her head against Elia's shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her, and his mother smiled at them both from across the carriage. "What will we do now?" Margaret asked. Elias looked at her. His gray eyes were warm and his smile was real. "We will live," he said, "all of us, loudly and unapologetically." Margaret smiled, and as the carriage rolled north, she thought of the scullery maid she had been, the woman she had become, and the family she had found in the most unlikely of places. She had risked everything for a stranger in a corridor, and in return she had been given the world.